Today we are going to talk about how you can use project-based vouchers to improve your leasing. I'm going to spend about an hour and a half walking you through the process for awarding project-based vouchers and all the steps you must follow and how you may use those to be creative to meet your local housing needs. Then I'm going to turn over to Rain, who's going to talk to you about some of the things you'll need to know if you want to, when you're administering these vouchers. So this webinar is being provided by HUD with HUD support. So again, under the agenda, we're going to walk through an overview of the PBV process, an overview of how property owners would apply for PBV, details on how to make an award, executing your housing assistance payment contract, program management and processes, and program monitoring. Even though the agenda says questions and wrap up, we are asking that all questions be submitted in the chat, and all questions be submitted in the chat, and we will be issuing a Q&A document that will be posted to the HUD Exchange along with this webinar. As I mentioned, I am Michael Tunovitz, a Senior Vice President for CBR Associates, and I've been working in the public housing industry for nearly 30 years. Again, I have Rain Schreiner with me, who has well over 20 years of affordable housing experience, and most recently has been involved in managing the voucher program for the Buffalo Municipal Housing Authority. So why would you want to use project-based vouchers? There is a lot that needs to be considered. There could be a lack of quality affordable housing in your program's jurisdiction. So this may be an opportunity to expand that stock. You also have to think about what is the size of your waiting list? Are there a lot of people waiting who could use a voucher if there was property available? What are the needs of your community? Are there pressing needs? Do you need more affordable housing? Is there housing? Do you need it constructed? Do you need housing, for example, that it could be viable if it was rehabilitated, or that potentially it's historic and could be preserved? Do you have needs for some of your special purpose families? For example, do you need more veterans housing? Could VASH vouchers be better utilized if they were project-based? In many communities, there are limited development resources. And while project-based vouchers will not themselves pay for a new development, they are a source of operating revenue once a site is assisted, so it could present additional opportunities for leveraging of debt to construct or rehab affordable housing. In some communities, the current housing is obsolete, so there could be concerns with crime or quality of life that could be addressed with project-based vouchers. If you're in a housing authority that owns public housing and is looking to redevelop its existing housing, perhaps replace existing public housing through a Section 18 conversion, or a mixed finance development that would replace existing public housing with a mix of affordable and market rate units, a PBV can be an option. And finally, project-based vouchers can be a way to ensure that there is affordable housing available in very high rent areas or in low rent areas, making sure that the quality of the housing that's available is very high. There are a lot of rules that apply to the PBV program. And that's one thing you need to remember with the award of project-based vouchers. There are a lot of rules to follow, and there are a lot of steps. None of them are complicated, but I would refer to them as tedious. There's even a PBV checklist on the HUD website to make sure that you followed every step. So the rules, 24 CFR 983 is the most important set of rules. Those are the ones that govern the PBV program. But some of the tenant-based rules will apply to PBV. Also, the HQS applies to project-based vouchers. Fair market rents are applicable, though as we'll talk about later, payment standards are not. All the calculations for tenant income and utility allowances are the same as a tenant-based program. For new construction and rehab, Davis-Bacon will apply. And also, most recently, PIH Notice 2017-21 was published. This notice goes into detail about per program cap, so how many units can you project base, and how many units can you project base at a specific site. I will say, in addition, your Uniform Relocation Act, fair housing, all of those rules would apply to the project-based voucher program. So overview, project-based vouchers are not new funding. They are just a component of your existing HCV program. So when you project-based vouchers, you are allocating a portion of your authorized units to be project-based instead of tenant-based. So PBV is just a little different from your tenant-based program. Under the tenant-based program, the family has a voucher and they're searching for their own unit. But in PBV, there is no voucher, there's no RTA, because the family is not searching for a unit. They are being assigned an available project-based voucher unit when they come to the top of the list. As I mentioned, there are not additional funds, but if you were setting aside vouchers for a pending project-based voucher award, you may be eligible for set-aside funds. I believe that this year's window to apply for set-aside funds for PBV has closed, but you should take a look at PIH Notice 2022-9 because that does explain the process. And you can set aside up to 20% of your units, your voucher program units for PBV, and in some cases, if you're serving a special needs population, that can go up to 30%. The house, again, as I've mentioned already, the funding for PBV units is coming out of your normal voucher funding that is funding your tenant-based program. Projects are typically selected through a competitive process, but not always. But generally speaking, you're going to be using an RFP that includes review and ranking criteria to determine that the proposed project meets all of HUD's criteria and it meets community needs. The assistance is attached to the unit, not the specific family. And then housing assistance is tied to specific number of units and actually specific units in the project. And then if one tenant moves out and another tenant moves in, that unit remains assisted. And unlike the tenant-based program, in the project-based program, the housing authority enters into a housing assistance payment contract with the owner for all of the units that are part of the contract. It is not an individual HAP contract per family. So again, some more differences between tenant-based and project-based. Again, HCV is generally tenant-based. However, if a family does decide to move into a project-based unit, they do have the right to move with a tenant-based voucher after 1 year if there's a voucher available for them. If there is not a voucher available to them, housing authorities do have to place the families on a waiting list to receive priority once vouchers become available. A common question that we get is how do you prevent PBV sites from being high turnover, that having families get to the top of a project-based voucher site, live there for a year, and then move again with their voucher, and so that you're constantly turning over your PBV units. And I can tell you the best practice for preventing that is working with project-based voucher owners who maintain high-level properties that families do not want to move out of. As I've already mentioned, both the project-based voucher and housing choice voucher follow the regulations at CFR 982. So your role as the PHA is very similar whether it's a project-based or a tenant-based. So HQS enforcement is still going to apply, abatements, all of the other requirements that an owner has to follow will still be in place, except portability does not apply. A family in a project-based unit cannot port out. And then again, the voucher, when it's a project-based unit, the family does not get issued a voucher because they are not engaging in a housing search. They will essentially, as Rain will explain later, come to the top of the list, be determined eligible, and if they're interested in the project-based unit that's available, it will be offered to the family. HAP contracts. One notable difference in the project-based voucher, there is one HAP contract for all of the units, whereas in the tenant-based portion of the program, each household has their own HAP contract. Also, in the project-based program, the HAP contract can be up to 20 years and can be extended for up to another 20 years. So when you're awarding project-based vouchers, you need to be mindful that you are making a 20 to 40-year commitment to work with this owner as a partner to provide affordable housing. So therefore, it's very important to have strong criteria for deciding whether or not to award project-based vouchers. Rent reasonableness is generally the same, but there are some differences. In the tenant-based program, a reasonable rent can be approved even if it's above the payment standard, as long as it's reasonable and affordable. In the project-based voucher program, the rent still must be reasonable, but it cannot exceed 110% of the FMR or small area FMR or any other HUD approved exception payment standard that exists. And it can also go, there's some very limited circumstances where a PBV rent can be above 110% of the FMR and go up to the tax credit rent. But those situations are rare and they need to be looked at case by case. Under the HCV program, the owner does request a rent increase and it is applied to the individual tenant. In the PBV program, the owner will request one rent increase for the site annually that corresponds with the anniversary date of the HAP contract, and it is applied to all similar units at the same time. So rather than having to request an increase for every unit, the owner could submit an increase, one increase for all one-bedroom units, another increase for all two-bedroom units, etc. So the rent increase processing and rent reasonableness processing is streamlined. Inspections, for tenant-based units, all units have to be inspected annually or biannually, depending on what you've adopted in your admin plan. In the PBV program, it's assumed that the owner is maintaining their properties in a consistent manner for all units. So you are allowed to perform a sample of inspections, 20% of the units in each building on an annual or biannual basis, depending on your policy. However, if more than 20% of those units fail, then you do need to inspect the rest of the building. In HCV, the tenant share can vary depending on depending on the affordability rules and whether the reasonable rent is above or below the payment standard. In the PBV program, there are no payment standards. The tenant share of rent and the HAP are based upon 30% of income and the approved rent and the approved utility allowance. So the tenant share, the tenant's share of rent is their total tenant payment, and then the HAP is paid by the PHA. And then payment standards, utility allowances. The HCV program has payment standards, but PBV does not, though the same utility allowance schedule is used for both the tenant-based and project-based program. Application process. And when I talk about application process in this context, I mean having an owner or developer apply to the housing authority to use project-based vouchers. So Housing Authority can use up to 20% of its authorized voucher units for project-based units. If the owner is agreeing to rehabilitate, or construct new affordable units, or if they're agreeing to set aside certain existing units for the purposes of providing affordable housing. You are allowed to go up to 30% of your authorized vouchers if the units are reserved for the homeless, for veterans, persons receiving or persons requiring supportive services. And let me make that clear, the supportive services need to be available, but they're not mandatory. And you can also use that extra 10% in low poverty census tracts. All of this, what percentage of your ACC you're going to set as your cap needs to be outlined in your agency plan. Also, in order to make sure you're not going over the cap, there is a program cap calculation worksheet, and the worksheet can be found in PIH Notice 2017-21. Project caps. So in addition to a cap on how many of your vouchers you can project base, there's also a cap on the number of units that can be project based in an individual project. Generally speaking, the income mix requirement is that it's the greater of 25 units or 25% of the project. So for most projects, it's going to be, for smaller projects, your cap is generally going to be 25 units. For larger projects, your cap is going to be 25% of the units. And the following types of units are excluded from the cap. If units are exclusively serving the elderly, then you can go up to 100% of the units. Also, if the units are for families who are eligible for supportive services, you can exceed the cap and go up to 100%. And then if the units are in a low poverty census tract, you can project base up to 40% of the units. HUD has not yet, but they may be establishing additional requirements and monitoring for oversight of projects in which more than 40% of the units are assisted under a PBV. So what's important there is that you need to be monitoring. So if you have sites that are project basing more than 40% of the units, to make sure that they're serving exclusively elderly, or make sure that supportive services are available for all families who live in a PBV unit. Types of PBV project and basic requirements. There are 3 different types of projects that can be assisted with PBV, and I'll talk about 2 of them together. New construction and rehabilitated units. New construction, obviously, those are units that do not exist at the point in time that that PBV is requested. And rehabilitated units, those are units that do not substantially comply with HQS at the time of the PBV application and do require substantial rehabilitation in order to become HQS compliant. In each of those cases, certain basic requirements have to be met. They are subject to an environmental review. They're also subject to a subsidy layering review. So the purpose of that review is HUD is going to look at all the governmental funding sources. So let me clarify, they're subject to a subsidy layering review if there's PBV and 1 or more other sources of governmental funding. And through the review, HUD will ensure that all of the sources of funding for the project and uses are appropriate, and that the costs that the owner is allocating to profit and overhead are within certain standards. They also will make sure that the project is going to cash flow properly and that it stays within certain limits of cash flow so that there's sufficient cash flow, but it's not excess. And also to make sure that the project is going to generate adequate revenue to cover its debt service. So again, the purpose of the subsidy layering review is to make sure there is enough funding, but not excess government funding in the transaction. And then the project will also be subject to an AHAP. That is a commitment to enter into a HAP contract once the units are ready. And in that agreement, the developer or owner is agreeing to several key things. That if Davis-Bacon applies, that they're going to follow it, that they're going to build the units so that they will be compliant with HQS. If Clean Air or Clean Water Act or other federal requirements apply, that they will adhere to them. Existing units, they're a little more straightforward. Those are units that mostly comply with HQS, and I will say substantially comply with HQS at the time of the application for vouchers. An environmental review is required, but it's possible that your responsible entity will rule that the project is categorically excluded. Also, the units have to pass HQS inspection before you move forward with assistance. But the process is a little more streamlined because these are existing units. One important thing to remember with existing units is if any rehab is done post-HAP contract, during the first 18 months the units are under contract, if rehab work is done, it is subject to Davis-Bacon. Administrative plan. This is important. You have to have your administrative plan up to date, which also means, while it's not on the slide, your agency plan has to be up to date, and your agency plan must contemplate the use of project-based vouchers as a tool for promoting affordable housing in the community. And it's very important that it be in the agency plan so that the public comment period and the public has had the opportunity to be aware that project-based vouchers might get used. And then the admin plan should include information about your project-based voucher process, including how you're going to advertise and what your selection criteria are going to be, some general, what your general project-based voucher program goals are. For example, are your goals to expand the overall stock of housing? Are you trying to expand the number of family units if that's a need in your community? If your community needs more elderly units? So again, outlining what is the goal? Why is the agency planning to use project-based vouchers? It also does need to outline those exceptions that you will use if you're going to give PBV to more than 25% of the units in a specific project. Particularly needs to outline what will qualify as acceptable supportive services for the purposes of exceeding that cap. It also needs to establish your waiting list selection procedures, whether you're going to use one list for all of your tenant-based and project-based, or if you're going to use site-based lists. And again, Rain will delve into that later in this presentation. And then it's going to, the admin plan should also talk about how you're going to screen tenants for suitability for PBV units. And what's important with PBV is there is a two-stage screening. One is that they have to be eligible for the PBV program, for the HCV program, but they also have to be suitable based upon the owner's tenant selection criteria. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of steps to awarding project-based vouchers, and it's really important to follow those steps in the proper order so that you don't risk having an audit of your award and having someone determine that it was not a valid award. So the first thing is called the Notice of Intent to Award PBV. And this is a notice that has to be sent to HUD. All of the instructions on how to do this are included in PAH Notice 2017-21. And that includes a link to the calculation worksheet. And it's a spreadsheet that allows you to enter the number of ACC units, the number of project-based vouchers you may already have, the number you intend to award, how they may fit into those various special categories. So you're going to submit that to the field office, because the field office is going to look at the number of units you have authorized, number of PBV units that you may have that may be excluded from a percentage limitation. For example, if you have PBV units under RAD or a Section 18 conversion, that, where you're replacing public housing with PBV, those do not count against your 20% cap. HUD's also going to look at how many units qualify under your 10% cap exemption, and they're going to look at how many units are committed to PBV that are under contract, under an AHAP, or that are covered by a selection that you've already selected them, but they're not awarded. They're also finally going to look at the number of units which you're planning to project base, and they're going to make sure that all of these in total fit within the program caps. So you're required to submit a notice of intent to award no less than 14 calendar days before you undertake issuing a request for proposals, selecting a project based on a previous competition, which I'm going to talk about momentarily, or when applicable, selecting a project without following a competitive process. The notice of intent is submitted by email to pbvsubmissions@hud.gov, and HUD will respond to the submission and identify any issues. And the guidance says that you should not proceed with the next steps until HUD has responded. Owner proposal and selection. Your admin plan should say and state which of these methods you're planning to use. So there are three selections processes. One is a request for proposal. So it would be essentially that owners would be submitting a proposal to you to award PBV. It would include your review and ranking criteria so that you can score proposals that meet your needs, would allow you to identify proposals that do not meet all HUD requirements and reject them. But you need to be careful. Sometimes housing authorities or community may be interested in redeveloping a specific building or developing a specific piece of land, but you have to be careful to make sure it's an open, competitive process that doesn't, for all practical purposes, limit proposals to a single site. You may set criteria that will allow priority projects for the community to score well, but you cannot set criteria that would make it impossible for anybody else to submit a proposal. A very common route is selection based upon previous competition. So, for example, if a developer has received a 9% tax credit award, or has received CDBG or home funds through a competition, and as they're moving forward with the development, they're realizing that even with that funding for construction, that it may be difficult for residents to be able to afford their share of the rents without some form of rental subsidy. So if your PHA allows it, you can accept proposals from owners that have already received competitive funding within the past 3 years, and you can award PBV without going through a full RFP process, because it's presumed that the prior competition has already deemed the project to have a valid public purpose. You have to be really careful here because the project still has to be able to meet all other HUD requirements. And you also cannot make a contingent award. You cannot make an award of PBV now that's contingent upon getting other competitive funding, because many tax credit and other funding sources will give bonus points for a project that already has PBV. And if you were to use the non-competitive avenue in this case, it would be considered that other proposal had an unfair advantage. There are some non-competitive selection criteria. They generally pertain to RAD conversions or the replacement of public housing with PBV units when you're replacing with the same number and type of units on the same site. Also, it is important to note, housing authority owned units can be assisted under the PBV program, but there are some extra requirements to make sure that the process was arm's length. So either your HUD field office or a HUD approved independent entity, it could be your city or county's planning department, for example, has to review the award of PBV as well as perform the rent reasonableness and the HQS inspections to make sure that the PBV award and any approvals that happen after the award are done at an arm's length, to make sure that as a housing authority that you're treating your own properties with PBV in the same manner you would treat a third-party owner. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of steps that need to be followed in the correct order to make sure that you don't make any mistakes or skip any steps during the PBV process. As I've already mentioned, you do need to make sure your agency plan outlines your intent to use PBV. It doesn't have to detail that you plan to use 20 vouchers at site A and 50 at site B, because you may not know where the PBV is going to be used, or not only might not, you will not know where the PBV is going to be used prior to a competition. But it does need to at least outline that you plan to use project-based vouchers as a tool to promote affordable housing. And if you know the number you intend to award, I suggest listing it. Your administrative plan should detail all of your procedures for PBV and your criteria for award. You should have an application. And I suggest an application not only for competitive applications of PBV, but also having an application that you would use for non-competitive situations. And the purpose of the application is to make sure that the owner submits all the information you need, not only to score a competitive proposal, but to make sure that a non-competitive proposal meets all of the HUD criteria to be awarded PBV. And it's not necessarily listed here yet, but before you issue that RFP, you are going to need to submit that notice of intent. And that has to happen between steps 2 and 3 on this screen. If you are moving to an RFP, then once HUD has given you feedback, then you can publish your request for proposal. If you're accepting non-competitive applications, once HUD has approved your notice of intent, you can start accepting those non-competitive applications. Then if you are considering putting PBV on your own units, you need to identify who's going to do the independent entity review, whether it's going to be whether it's HUD or some other local agency. If it's not HUD, HUD needs to approve that local agency, and while it's not required, it's generally recommended that you enter into a memorandum of agreement. Once you receive your proposals, they should be reviewed and ranked. If they're non-competitive proposals, you need to make sure that they are compliant with all HUD requirements. You also need to make sure that the proposed number of units fits within your program cap, and also you need to make sure that the proposed number of units at each project fit within their project cap. If you have PHA-owned units that are part of your process, all of your reviews and approvals need to be sent to the independent entity so that they can confirm that the award was made in accordance with your admin plan, and then they can make a preliminary determination of rent and a preliminary HQS review. For existing housing, that would be determining that the units substantially comply. For rehab and new construction, generally that review is less. It's just looking at the proposed project and making sure what's being proposed represents a project that can meet HQS when construction or rehab is complete. It's important then that you issue your notice of PBV award, and we refer to these as contingent awards. because they are still going to be contingent on several things. They're going to be contingent on the units, for example, passing HQS. They're going to be contingent upon environmental review, also receipt and award of all funding, and a successful subsidy layering review, just to name some of your contingencies. Then number 8, mail the award letters. That may seem obvious, but with sometimes with PHA units, it is a step that gets forgotten. And there has to be an official notification of the award of the PBV, because it becomes important at a later date with regards to the subsidy layering review. At this point in time, you're going to be able to move straight to HAP contract if these are existing units and you have all your verification that the units are categorically excluded from environmental review. But for rehab and new construction, the environmental review needs to be done. All funding needs to be in place, and then you submit all of the necessary documents to HUD for a subsidy layering review. And there is an extensive checklist. You generally cannot move to closing, which includes signing the AHAP agreement, until such time as HUD has completed the subsidy layering review. It's something to be mindful of because it's what I would consider a long lead item, meaning that this can take 60 to 90 days for HUD to get through its review process, meaning that it needs to start 90 days before you intend to close. Again, the AHAP contract is generally signed at closing, but it must be signed before any work can be done on the site. Even site prep and demolition is not currently allowed prior to signing the AHAP. While construction is happening, you have to monitor AHAP compliance. The two most notable things are the Davis-Bacon Act, so making sure that the owner is paying the proper wage rates and is submitting certified payrolls. The other is in rehab, sometimes people need to be displaced, and all displacement for PBV units has to be done in accordance with the Uniform Relocation Act. And then once the units are ready to come online, you will make a final determination of what those rents are, make sure they're rent reasonable. There was a requirement that it is no longer in place, so this, I apologize, this slide is slightly outdated, but you do not need a state certified appraiser to approve the rents, but you do have to determine that the rents are reasonable. In many cases, those were the project funding included a market study that lists the rents. It is a good source of rent reasonableness. If not, your own voucher program's rent reasonableness database is sufficient. So once the units are ready for occupancy, meaning that the certificates of occupancy have been issued, then you can perform your HQS inspections. And again, if they're your own units, your independent entity will do it. And then you can execute the HAP contract. It may be in one stage, or if units are coming online in stages, you can sign a multi-stage HAP contract. And then you would start leasing up and continue your normal administrative activities. And then your ongoing inspections and rent determinations would happen. And ongoing inspections include at turnover and annually. PHA-owned. This is important, and it is has been defined even more detail in PAH notice 2017-21. But it is a building that is owned by your housing authority. It's owned by an entity that your housing authority wholly controls, or an LLC, which is controlled by your housing authority. If a project has previously been designated as PHA-owned and you want to reclassify it, it requires a legal opinion. And generally speaking, a controlling interest is that your PHA holds more than 50% ownership interest in the entity that's managing and owning the units. Independent entity, as I mentioned earlier, It can be a unit of local government, or it can be a HUD approved entity. In some cases, I've even seen it be a third-party vendor, as long as that vendor is independent otherwise, if they're not doing other work for the agency. So the independent entity, they do have to review your selection process. They also have to agree to the length and review the initial HAP contract and extensions. They need to make a rent reasonableness determination of the initial rents and the annual rents. Again, all of this is PHA owned only. So if this is not PHA owned units, nothing we're saying applies. But again, for your PHA owned units, your independent entity will conduct your HQS inspections and all of your rent reasonableness reviews. Proper award. This PAH notice 2011-54, which pertains to project-based vouchers. This is a caution just to keep you out of some trouble. A low-income housing tax credit competition can only be considered for PBVs if the PBVs were not committed prior to the application. I will also note that 4% tax credits are not considered competitive, so a 4% tax credit award is not deemed a prior competition for the purposes of awarding PBV. Prohibition on retroactive waivers. Why are all these steps so important? There seem to be a lot of them. They seem tedious. They at sometimes actually seem burdensome. But in a letter that HUD put out to all housing authorities almost 10 years ago, they told PHAs that you cannot get a retroactive waiver for missing a step. So the only time you can get a waiver to skip a step with PBV has to be for good cause. And generally good cause may pertain to something such as a natural disaster. So where we quickly need to attach PBV units to a site in order to bring affordable housing units back online in the community. So HUD is, but other than that, HUD is not going to approve a waiver if you've already violated the PBV rules. So in the past, people used to, pardon the cliche, but shoot first, ask questions later. And if HUD was concerned about a mistake, they would ask for a waiver. Now, from this letter, HUD said, if you violate program rules, you can't get a waiver, but we may also take enforcement action. But any notice of violation and actions will be in writing, but enforcement could include any remedy that's in your ACC contract, the HAP contract, or the AHAP. And one that I have seen was that HUD did, at a PHA that I worked with about 10 years ago, they did say that the PBV award was not valid and that they had to cancel the HAP contract immediately, and that all housing assistance payments that had been made to the owner needed to be repaid to HUD using non-federal funds. So while those rules, they could seem burdensome and tedious, you put yourself at substantial risk if you choose not to follow them. So there are some types of units that are not eligible for PBV. One is shared housing. So if somebody is, there are some types of housing where someone may be renting one room and sharing a kitchen. Of course, units on the grounds of a prison or a hospital or a medical institution are not eligible. Units controlled by educational institutions, so basically dormitories, are not eligible for PBV. And manufactured homes and cooperatives and transitional housing are not considered eligible for PBV. Elevator buildings, any high rise, generally speaking right now, PBV is not permitted in for families with children in high rises, more than 7 floors and 12 units. But there are exceptions there. But also PBV units cannot be used in owner occupied. You cannot PBV a home ownership unit. And Housing that's already, the rent is already subsidized from another source cannot have PBV, so there cannot be a duplicate subsidy. Initial contract rents. This is important. As I already said, payment standards do not apply. So if you have payment standards that are less than 110% of the fair market rent or the smaller area fair market rent, it doesn't matter because the PBV rents are based on the PBV rules. So the initial contract rent can be up to 110% of the small area or regular fair market rent. If your jurisdiction has approval for a higher exception payment standard, many agencies currently have approval to be at the 120% of FMR through the HUD waivers. So if you have an exception, to go up to 120% or more, then your PBV rents could go up to that exception amount as well. Also, the initial rents become the floor, and the PBV contract can be set up so that the rents will never go below that initial rent should your fair market rents go down. So those, again, initial rents generally 110% of the FMR. They must be reasonable as compared to your unassisted housing. And then also they are set at the lowest of 110%, the rent reasonable amount, or the owner's request. So if the owner hasn't requested 110% of the FMR, even if they would be entitled to it, they don't get it. So it's the lowest of these three. Rent reasonableness. Rent reasonableness for your PHA units should be conducted by your independent entity. You should keep documentation on file of how the rent reasonableness was determined, but it's completed for all similar size units simultaneously at the initial and rent increases. And what makes it a little different is you don't need the rent reasonableness in every tenant's file because the rent reasonableness is for the units and the property. So you can keep your rent reasonableness determinations in the property file, not the tenant files. We're going to start to talk about HAP contract effective dates. For new and rehab units, the HAP contract won't be effective till the project has been completed and has passed inspection. Whereas for existing units, the project already exists, so you're able to proceed once the units pass their HQS. The term of the HAP contract is 20 years and can be extended for up to an additional 20 years. And I recommend staying in 20-year increments because that makes PBV more palatable to developers. It also makes it more desirable to investors and shows that you as an agency have a long-term commitment to this housing. What is on the HAP contracts? There is a lot on the HAP contract. There's also a lot on the AHAP, which is also known as the agreement. So in the HAP contract, these exhibits are important and they protect you. So it's going to list the first exhibit on the HAP contract, the total number of units that are covered by that are going to be assisted, what the initial rents are, and the number and description of the units. So you need the exact units. What are their addresses? What are their bedroom sizes? And if it's a multi-stage project, you need to break it down by stages. And it's important that the specific addresses be listed because PBV units cannot be floated. So if the owner wants to change which units are to be assisted, they have to get your approval first. The contract also has to include what services, maintenance, and equipment are provided by the owner. So what utilities are there? Is the owner providing the stove and fridge, or are the tenant? So that's at C, it has this exact breakdown of who pays what utilities. And Exhibit D outlines any features that are going to be in the units to ensure the units are handicap accessible and comply with 504, Section 504. The other box, that's the contents of the agreement. That's the agreement signed at closing. So the agreement has the first attachment is the owner's approved proposal. So when they are agreeing to proceed with construction or rehab, they are agreeing to do so in accordance with what they proposed. Exhibit B of that agreement, it describes the work that's going to be performed. If the agreement is for a certain level of rehab, there should be rehab write-ups, and the owner has to rehab to that standard. If it's new construction, there should be some level of drawings and specifications that are an exhibit, because that's what the owner needs to build to. If you have any local requirements beyond HQS regarding quality and design, those will need to be part of the agreement. And then anything that's required for fair housing or 504 compliance should be there. And then finally, Exhibit C, it's going to describe the project site. It's again going to describe the total number of units in the project that were covered. So your AHAP total units and mix of unit sizes and your HAP should match. Again, and then the AHAP is going to have all of your services, maintenance, and utility, and that should match the HAP contract. The owner cannot change any of the terms from the agreement to the full HAP contract unless you've mutually agreed to it and you've reviewed and you've re-reviewed all the rents and the rent reasonableness and made sure that making that change is appropriate. Some other key terms I'm talking about are both the HAP contract and the AHAP. First, for the HAP contract, it will include your term of your contract, including extensions. It does have a contingency that says that the contract is only good if there are sufficient appropriations. It talks about that you're only going to pay for occupied units and the terms under which you'll pay. If you're paying vacancy payments, it will include the necessary language. And this form, it's a standard HUD form with check boxes, so you don't have to incorporate specific payment terms and specific vacancy payment terms. It is all HUD prescribed. However, the HAP contract will also outline if you have units that are specifically for elderly, specifically for disabled, specifically for families for whom supportive services are available. Similarly, the AHAP, again, signed at closing, does have some key provisions that the owner needs to be aware of, but meaning that you get to accept the work or you get to determine that the work's not acceptable. It makes it clear that you're not going to sign that HAP contract till you've accepted the work. Generally, that's done by verifying Davis-Bacon compliance and your HQS inspections. And it clarifies that the initial determination of rent that was established, and it makes it clear that at no time can the rent exceed what is approvable by HUD, or what's approvable in accordance with the HUD regulations. Okay, over the past hour, I have said quite a bit, so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and friend Rain Schreiner. She's going to talk to you about program management and processes that you need to be familiar with.
Awesome. Thank you for all of that. As you said, now we're going to spend some time talking about the program management and processes. So as part of the program management, it is required that you maintain master files for all of your PBV contracts. And in these master files, there's certain documentation that is required to be kept in these files. So, so in the master files should include, of course, the PBV application, the PBV initial documents, including the AHAP, environmental review, subsidy layering, etc., and the HAP contract, all parts and amendments, the fully executed and dated. Listing of specific units covered under the HAP contract, the inspection reports. The initial ones do not need to be kept in the tenant files, but they do need to be kept in the master file. The rent increase requests, as Michael had mentioned earlier, that the requests and the rent reasonable testing is not required to be in the individual tenant file. However, they do need to be kept in the master file. And summary information of the property and any vacancy claims and approvals. Now, these master files can be kept electronically or a hard copy. So the PBV in place families, in places are eligible families residing in the proposed PBV contract unit on the date the proposal is selected. And these families are afforded protection from displacement in accordance with the URA. Any residential occupant who qualifies as a displaced family is entitled to payment for moving and related expenses and to an offer of comparable replacement housing. Once the family's continued eligibility is determined, the family must be given an absolute selection preference. The admission of eligible in-place families is not subject to income targeting requirements. So, you will be reviewing their income to determine their assistance on the unit, but they're not subject to the income targeting requirements. So the waiting list administration, the PHA can establish and manage separate waiting lists for individual projects or buildings that are receiving PBV assistance, or the PHA can canvass its HCV waiting list for eligible applicants. The PBV programs have the same waiting list preference as HCV families who meet mainstream eligibility requirements. As the units become vacant, property management must communicate with the HCV staff. If the accessible unit becomes available, the property should offer that unit to an on-site resident with accessibility needs. That's priority. And if no current resident, if there is nobody that is waiting on one of those units, offers must be made to families that include members with disabilities who require such accessibility features. For refusal of assistance, if the family refuses to offer a PBV assistance, offer of the PBV assistance, or the owner rejects the family for admission to the unit, the PHA may remove the family from the waiting list from which it was selected. However, they cannot refuse to list the applicant on the waiting list for the tenant-based assistance. They cannot deny any admission preference for which the applicant qualifies. They cannot change the applicant's place on the HCV waiting list based on preference, date, time, and time of application or other factors affecting selection under the PHA's selection policy. And they cannot remove the applicant from the tenant-based waiting list, tenant-based voucher waiting list. Responsibilities of the HCV program. So like Michael was talking about earlier, PBV is a little bit different, but much of it is the same for managing the program. So we're going to talk about some differences here. So the responsibilities of the Housing Choice Voucher Program is you manage and select from the waiting list following your tenant selection procedures. You provide the referrals of the eligible families to the property management company or owner. You conduct the turnover HQS inspections. So when a family moves out, it is required to do another inspection before another family can move into the unit. It's your responsibility to ensure that the family qualifies under the HCV eligibility requirements. It's your responsibility to conduct the briefing, obtain the lease from the property management company, complete the tenancy addendum, of course, releasing HAP, and follow-up would be completing any annual re-exams and interims for the family and adjusting the tenant's portion as determined necessary. So the tenancy addendum is similar. So the tenant-based program is you sign off on the HAP, and that is the agreement between the HCV program and the owner. The tenancy addendum, since you already have the HAP in place for the project, the tenancy addendum is what's signed off, and this tenancy addendum is the last thing that's signed off before you can come to full lease up in that unit. This tenancy addendum is signed it's generated by the HCV program and sent to the owner and is signed by the owner and the tenant. That is returned back to the HCV program where it is placed in the file. Of course, the administrative plan, and Michael touched on this earlier as well, you should have your project-based voucher chapter in your administrative plan, and you should read that and be up on that before you start managing the PBV contract. Responsibilities of the owner. As Michael talked about suitability earlier, it is the property manager's responsibility to determine suitability for tenancy. This is not screened by the HCV program. They're also responsible for providing all services, of course, the maintenance, equipment, upkeep of the unit, utilities agreed to under the HAP contract and the lease. They advise of notices and vacant units as soon as possible. They will complete all their tax credit, if applicable, application that's processed on the property management or the owner's side. The move into the family, collecting their security deposits, those requirements, signing the lease. They would sign off on the tenancy addendum and the statement of family responsibility, which we'll talk about in a minute, but it is the responsibility of the property owner. Notifying of any lease changes or violations, collecting the family's monthly portion of the rent, assisting HCV with important notifications to the family, and of course, keeping the HCV program informed of any vacancies and any other issues in the units. So the actual process from beginning to end is you have a vacancy, an HQS initial inspection is conducted, the waiting list selection. You will have the waiting list selection and then determining eligibility on the HCV side, of course, certification, conducting the briefing, lease up and contract execution, and then of course, management and compliance. For unit vacancies, the property manager or property management team or owner will notify the housing authority of any vacancies. The owner must promptly notify the PHA of any vacancies or expected vacancies in a contract unit. After receiving such notice, the PHA must make a reasonable effort to promptly refer a sufficient number of families for the owners to fill such vacancies. So notifying the PHA in advance of the vacancy when possible and when aware that the unit has become vacant. The PHA's policy, the owner must notify the PHA in writing by mail or email within 5 business days of learning about any vacancy or expected vacancy. This may vary across your admin plan. That's why it's important to know what you have written in the admin plan and work that out with the property management company so they're aware of what those requirements are. The PHA's policy, the PHA will make every reasonable effort to refer families to the owner within a reasonable, this is specific, which within a reasonable number of days after receiving notice from the owner. So the vacancy timeline, the owner does notify the PHA of the vacancy in a short period of time. The housing authority needs to refer those families to fill the vacancy. The PHA gives notice to the owner that the HAP will be amended if those units are not filled within 120 days. And then the first of the next month, the amendment is effective the following month. In instances where the PHA has caused the delay for leasing new families, the property may be eligible to receive vacancy payments. And that would be in your admin plan as well. Approved vacancy payments will begin the first calendar month after the move out month for a period not to exceed 2 full months following the move out month. Inspections. So all units must pass the HQS inspection prior to lease up and contract execution. Upon written notification of a vacant unit, PHA will coordinate an inspection of the unit within the time frame established in the administrative plan. So HQS, so of course, as with the tenant based vouchers, you would have the initial inspections. The units must be inspected to ensure compliance prior to payment. And the inspections must be performed by, inspections of a PHA-owned property units must be performed by an independent entity. Biennial inspections, the PHA or its third-party inspector must inspect a random sample of 20% of all units at least biennially during an assisted tenancy. Turnover inspections do not count towards the 20%. If more than 20% of the sample fails, 100% of the contracted units in the building must be inspected. And the PHA cannot make payments for a unit that fails inspection, fails to meet HQS, unless any cited items are corrected within the prescribed time frame. Other inspections, of course, are complaint inspections. The PHA must inspect contract units whenever needed to determine that the contract units comply with HQS and that the owner is providing maintenance. The PHA must take into account complaints and any other information coming to its attention in scheduling these inspections. Of course, the quality control inspections, the PHA must conduct supervisory quality control inspections. The PHA should include a representative sample of both tenant-based and project-based units. And the PHA units, of course, must be performed by an independent entity. Filling vacancies, the owners must promptly notify the PHA of any vacancy or expected vacancy in the contracted unit. After receiving such notice, the PHA must make every reasonable effort to promptly refer a sufficient number of families for the owner to fill such vacancies. The PHA and the owner must make reasonable efforts to minimize the likelihood and length of any vacancies. So this is speaking to the process we had just been talking about. And the PHA policy, the owner must notify the PHA in writing. This may be your policy in the admin plan, so there might be a little variation here. The owner must notify the PHA in writing, mail or email within 5 days, business days, of learning about any vacancy or expected vacancy. The PHA will make every reasonable effort to refer families to the owner within the 10 business days of receiving such notice. So you would need to check your admin plan for what that policy is. The pool of eligible families. So the HCV must screen and find the families proactively, hopefully before any vacancy notices, to ensure that units are occupied as quickly as possible to minimize the length of time that the unit is vacant. The HCV program has the responsibility to keep a plentiful pool of eligible applicants to ensure the expectation is met. And the best practices is the size of the applicant pool should be twice the amount of the average move-out rate for the property. The specialist assigned to the PBVs needs to ensure that the pool is replenished consistently. Pre-leasing briefing. When the family accepts an offer of the PBV assistance, the PHA will conduct an oral briefing. The briefing must include information on a description of how the program works, the family and the owner's responsibility. The family will be provided with a packet that includes information on the following subjects, which are how the PHA determines the total tenant payment, TTP, the family's obligations under the program, and the applicable fair housing information, which you probably have in the tenant-based voucher briefing packets as well. If the family's head or spouse is disabled, the PHA must take appropriate steps, of course, to ensure effective communication in conducting the oral briefing and providing the information packet. This is where you'll see that this is the same as the tenant-based. The PHA must ensure that persons with mobility notification of selection. Once they are selected from the waiting list, the PHA will notify the applicant in writing, and this will include the selection letter, the admission packet, the program documents that you send out with your admission packets. It has to include the deadline for responding. So if they have 30 days to respond, that should be in your letter, and then all requested documents and notice for failure to respond. Eligibility and certification. The PHA will determine eligibility, as we spoke about earlier. The PHA will gather all eligible documents in accordance with requirements and the PHA's HUD requirements and the PHA's administrative plan and approved processing procedures. So certification documents, so we just spoke about those and requesting those core documents. The citizenship, it's all the same as the tenant-based for those core documents. The program documents looks a little bit different, and I'll show you what those program documents are. And then, of course, the income, assets, and supporting documentation. So the briefing documents will include the tenancy addendum, which I just showed you, the lead-based paint disclosure, the statement of family responsibilities, HUD's discrimination complaint form, the RIP, and what you should know about EIV, things that you should know, VAWA, the debts owed, the fair housing equal opportunity for all, and the briefing presentation. I recommend, this is not required, I do recommend that the briefing checklist is kept in the tenant file as well, that the tenant is signing that they have received a copy of all of these documents. This is a good little checklist to keep in the file. Determining the unit size, of course, the PHA subsidy standards will determine the appropriate unit size for the PBV families. These standards are listed in the Housing Authority's administrative plan. The subsidy standards must provide for the smallest number of bedrooms needed and comply with HQS space requirements and be applied consistently across all families. Overhoused tenants, if the family composition changes, which results in the wrong size unit, the Housing Authority must offer the family the opportunity to receive continued assistance in another unit or issue a tenant-based voucher. There's no standard for the model lease for the PBV program. The lease must include specific items, which include the unit rent, the term of the lease, amount of tenant rent to owner, specification of services, maintenance, equipment, and utilities provided by the owner, the renewal and non-renewal clauses, and the PBV tenancy addendum. The initial term of the lease must be at least 1 year. In the PBV, the initial term of the lease agreement is not tied to the HAP contract. So the effective date of the HAP contract and the lease dates may look very different. Leases for residents who will remain in place must have an effective date that coincides with the effective date of the PBV contract, which must be signed on or after that date. So those families that are leasing up in place may in fact have the same date as the HAP contract. For the lease and contract execution, once the applicant has passed eligibility and property compliance approvals, PBV properties must coordinate the lease and tenancy addendum signing with the participant's family. So the lease generally comes from the property management. It comes over to the housing authority. The housing authority will then issue the tenancy addendum after reviewing the lease and issue the tenancy addendum to the property management. It will then be signed off by the tenant and the property management and sent back to the housing authority, who then can fully execute that contract. Annual recertifications. So the PBV recertification process is similar to the recertification process for the HCB, for the tenant-based program. The housing authority should notify participants of annual recertification requirements 90 to 120 days before the recertification effective date. Of course, this allows time for gathering those documents that are needed for completing the annual recertification. Interim recertifications, just like the tenant-based program, the interim recertifications are conducted by the housing authority in accordance with the administrative plan. And anytime the PHA can conduct or the family may request an interim of the family's composition or income to process those changes. Failure to report required changes or to supply any information requested by the PHA may be grounds for termination of assistance. The right to move. The family may terminate the assisted lease at any time after the first year of occupancy, but must give the owner advance written notice of the intent to vacate in accordance with the lease. This copy will be, the notice of intent to vacate must be sent to the PHA. If requested after 1 year of PBV tenancy, the tenant is eligible to request a tenant-based voucher. If those vouchers are not immediately available, the family must be given priority for the next available opportunity for continued assistance with a tenant-based voucher. If the family terminates the assisted lease before the end of 1 year, the family relinquishes the opportunity for continued assistance. So you'll want to look to your admin plan if there are any conditions on that, if they must be in good standing. So you'll want to look to your admin plan for direction on that as well. Rent increases. So the PHA determines the rent to owner. The property management or owner must request it in writing. So this will be processed upon the owner's request or where there's a 10% decrease in the published FMR. The rent increase, the PHA may not make any rent increase other than an increase in the rent to the owner is determined by, is pursuant by 983.301. The owner must request an increase in the rent to owner at the annual anniversary date of the HAP contract by written notice to the housing authority. So that HAP contract, even if you have a multi-stage contract, the initial date of the contract will always be the anniversary date of the HAP contract. The PHA may not approve, and the owner may not receive any increase of rent to owner until and unless the owner has complied with all requirements under the HAP contract, including compliance with HQS. So if you're going to process a rent increase, that rent increase gets applied across all units, even if a tenant moved in 3 months prior. They don't have to wait the full 12 months. So that rent increase again gets applied across all of the units under the PBV contract. The rent to owner for each contract may at no time exceed the reasonable rent changes for comparable units in the private unassisted markets, and the rent to owner cannot certainly not exceed 110% of the applicable FMR. Program monitoring. So of course, management of your files in CMAP and all the PVV units are subject to the same standards for CMAP and QCing those files. That includes QCing all of the CMAP indicators. So keep that in mind. And that was it.
All right, so thank you, Rain, thank you, Michael. We will post a document to HUD Exchange that includes all of your questions. And thank you again for participating in the webinar today.